Hi, thanks for joining me. I'm very happy to offer you another sonnet in this episode. We will be looking at George Herbert. I think another undervalued sonneteer, very innovative, very religious, and perhaps that's why people know him in the Episcopalian or Anglican tradition. And outside of that, perhaps he's a little less widely known. I myself am not particularly religious. I'm certainly not particularly Christian. But this poem really does speak to me as does a lot of his other work. So just because I may be a wretch who doesn't find the word of Jesus Christ to be particularly meaningful to me, these sentiments I find are everlasting. The same way that I can appreciate a great Basho poem, I can appreciate a great George Herbert poem. And here we go. Redemption. Having been tenant long to a rich lord, not thriving, I resolved to be bold and make a suit unto him to afford a new small rented lease and cancel the old. In heaven at his manor I him sought. They told me there that he was lately gone about some land, which he had dearly bought long since on earth, to take possession. I straight returned, and knowing his great birth, sought him accordingly in great resorts, in cities, theaters, gardens, parks, and courts. At length I heard a ragged noise and mirth of thieves and murderers. There him I espied, who straight your suit is granted said, and died. So what do I react to in this poem? Why do I find myself returning to this poem again and again and again? Well, let's start with what this poem is not. This poem is not a successful sonnet in many of the ways that so many successful sonnets we've covered in this channel have been. And why is that? Well, Herbert decides to basically disregard the convention of the volta. So the volta ought to be occurring, the pivot in the poem ought to be occurring after long since on earth to take possession. So we have here, that is the last line of that first 8 lines, the quatrain. We would expect this poem to enact a very big pivot here were it to be a proper sonnet. And in certain respects, you could say that it does, but in certain respects, Herbert just marches straight on through. I straight returned, he says. He continues narrating. He continues the action of the quatrain, which is pretty much a no-no. You're not supposed to do that. And by continuing to narrate, to basically give us a play-by-play of the game, and with 2 runners on, it's now Casey at bat. You know, it's not kosher. You're not supposed to do that because it violates the spirit of the volta. In the octave, you're supposed to observe. You're supposed to study and paint. And then you're supposed to pivot in the sestet to reflection. This poem doesn't do that. Herbert just runs roughshod over this whole idea. I straight returned and knowing his great birth, so that the speaker's still questing. The speaker's still wondering. The speaker's still trying to come to an end to their earthly conundrum, right? So he seeks him on earth. So that the poem hasn't really pivoted to the eternal because he's still looking around in these earthly places, in cities, theaters, gardens, parks, and courts. Not until we get to this kind of Shakespearean pivot at the end. This Shakespearean sonnet has these four quatrains, as we see here, four stanzas of 4. And then it has this last couplet at the end. So until we get to this last couplet, the poem never really enacts a true pivot to the eternal. Of thieves and murderers there I him espied, who straight your suit is granted said, and died. But it's not completely as thoroughly satisfying as we would like to have. Even this pivot seems to be belated, weak, and just kind of, okay, fine. You can have your damn cheaper rent, good enough. I got other things to do, mainly. Again, not completely enacting the spirit of the sonnet. So Herbert just runs completely and just totally disregards all these conventions as far as I'm concerned. But yet the poem is successful. It does observe in the first 8 lines. It does observe. It continues to observe, but it does observe. The manner of observing, though, isn't the type of painting, isn't the type of close study of nature or of character or of appearances that we would expect. Instead of giving us how people are dressed, how they look at one another, how flowers look, how hair looks, how eyes look, any of those things. There's no love. There's no affection. Having been tenant long to a rich lord is very, very dry. It's very businesslike, not thriving. I resolve it to be bold. So what the poet, the speaker of this poem, doesn't say, which is what's so impressive about this poem to me, what they don't say is, F it, dude. Everything that I've tried in life to try to make it, to try to get along in this middle-class existence, to try to strive to be one of the people who can kind of fake it and get through life, put their kids in good schools, dress in a non-shabby way. My wife has, the clothes that she needs. She has a new stove, whatever it is. We have a good carriage and things aren't perfect, but it's copacetic. It's good enough. Well, this speaker, it's not good enough. He's not hacking it. None of the stuff that he's tried has worked. In fact, he's in crisis. He's effed. He's in deep, deep doo-doo. He's basically living over his means consistently. And that's just this profound, crazy financial metaphor for basically life not working out. For all the things you expected, all that you wanted out of this existence, in almost this kind of Buddhist sense, your desires outstrip what you have and what you can afford. And at the end of the day, you have to go hat in hand and beg and beg and beg and beg for this opportunity to keep living, because otherwise you're going to go under. Your boat's taking on water, right? He needs a small rented lease. In other words, he's living too large. He has to try to get out of this agreement that he's already made to pay the big bucks to be a high roller or even be a part of this respectable class of people. But it's a metaphor. It's not about respect in this world. It's about respect for yourself. That's, I guess, what haunts me. So where does he go? He goes to some place that's impossible to go. I can't go there. You can't go there. The speaker of the poem can go there. In heaven at his manor I sought. How? It's just befuddling to me. How does he do that? It's a person of such desperation that he's able to pray to transport himself or meditate or whatever it is. He gets there. He goes and begs to heaven. And of course, ironically, despite all of his efforts to transport his spirit to another plane of existence, which has never worked for me despite my many efforts at this, God's not there. Long since on earth is where he is. So, realizing the terrible irony of the situation, I guess you could say we do have a Volta, right? In a sense. So that is where this pain and agony and irony of the poem comes to a head and flips around at the Volta. So I guess we do. I straight returned, and knowing his great birth. Again, a misunderstanding. Did Jesus Christ have a great birth? No, He had a very lowly birth. I mean, yes, he's the son of God, but it is another layer of irony here. Sought him accordingly in great resorts, which is not where you're going to find him. At the end of the day, the Savior is trying to help people who need help most, not the speaker. The speaker is doing okay, not great, probably in a kind of a spiritual crisis and a material crisis, but not as bad as the thieves and murderers. But nevertheless, the forgiveness is for everybody in the poem. For anyone who goes and looks, it's a powerful message for anybody who's able to read it, and the poem is written simply. It kind of appropriates this kind of business speak, this legalese, with this suits and afford, and suit is granted. I mean, I don't know that Jesus Christ says things like your suit is granted. But in this poem, he does. It's talking in parables. It's talking in riddles. I don't know. I can't really explain to you guys why this poem resonates so much for me, but it does. It makes life, the life that I'm living and the life that we're all living, seem thin, seem like cardboard. We all thrive. We're all striving to do better, to get ahead, to do better than the person next to us. To be respectable. And it's all garbage. It's all meaningless. It's totally and completely meaningless. And Herbert just cuts through all that shit like a knife. So I think I've said more than enough about this poem. I'd like to do another Herbert poem. Maybe we'll return and do his poem Praise next week. I think all of his poems are difficult in different ways. But I do like this one quite a bit. It's one of my favorite sonnets. And if I can share that with you, then that's a huge deal for me. So, thank you. See you soon.